Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
All right. For the sake of the video recording, my name is Alex Fisher. I am an American writer, curator, researcher, primarily working in the fields of contemporary art and architecture, dealing a lot with topics of performance as well as with the lyricism and lingo of the built environment. A lot of my work comes in the form of collaborating with artists, so engaging, whether it be in preparing an exhibition or preparing a new work, or reviewing a work, or writing a text about that work. A lot of sort of my place in this cultural creation is often a bit more anonymous because it is not necessarily my work that is being directly authored. So I thought, for the sake of this talk, to dwell a little bit on a work that I see as being a bit more original and coming more directly from my experience, particularly my experience as an expatriate living in contemporary Ukraine, living through a moment of construction and of evolution. So specifically focusing on my lived experience. And so the title of this presentation, it comes directly from a paper of the same name that's called Exclamatory Commonality in Contemporary Ukrainian Development. This research was prepared for the 2020 edition of the Tbilisi Architecture Biennial, which is, as the name suggests, an event that happens every 2 years that focuses on different histories and presence of built construction, primarily in Eastern and Southern Europe. Last year, I was one of the selected participants to write a new essay for the catalog. And so for this catalog essay, I researched the phenomenon of new construction in Ukraine, construction that is directly tied to Ukraine being a country which is increasingly a source of, or a site for investment of foreign capital, as well as a site for sort of increased urbanization. Ukraine is a country that, like many countries around the world, is experiencing a moment of intense urbanization, or cities growing bigger and being obliged to find new ways to identify themselves, root themselves while still growing. So to begin, I'll start with something that was kind of a overall thing I was considering in doing this research. It's that each city is a construction, as each city is something that humans have built up, often for very strategic purposes, as well as each city being in construction. Cities as sites of perpetual development, a city as being something that is never finished, so to say. So before I kind of dig in, I'm going to, this presentation will be a mixture of a few case studies or examples, as well as a few hypotheses or prompts that I have tried to pull out and tailor directly to either conflict with or correspond with some of the topics that we are discussing here at the Тіло, Землі artistic residency. So first is kind of my thesis, is that the character of commonality in Ukrainian cities is exclamatory, meaning it exclaims itself or shouts itself or yells itself, enunciating itself in the titles or names of business towers, clubhouses, cafes, and living complexes. I should say briefly that this biennial that this research was prepared for was dealing with this idea of common or commonness as a question mark in terms of trying to understand what do we have in common, who has this commonness, to what extent is commonness representative of one sliver of society, one small percentage of society, or is commonality shared by something of a larger group? So this propulsion towards incantation or shouting or exclaiming inspires this presentation. And this presentation encounters ego or personas and expanse or scope, distance, in the projects of two property development firms. The first being Saga Development, which is based in Kiev, and the second being Real Estate Corporation, which is based in Lviv, as well as a supporting cast of Consequential Ventures. There will be different segments in this presentation, which will take about 45 minutes. It'll move very quickly now that I've done this a bit long introduction. And the first section is, I'm calling it My City as Your House, and Your House as My City, so full of mirroring. And the first house I want to highlight, it's Philadelphia Concept House, which is a project by Saga Development in the Pechersk region, or Pechersk district, sorry, of Kiev. Philadelphia Concept House is a luxury development catered towards a business plus customer. It features a limited number of large apartments, so it's primarily geared towards people that have the capital to develop in big space. The Philadelphia Concept House is not finished. It has been in construction for 2.5 years already, and that's something that I find quite interesting, but also quite troubling about a lot of new infrastructure ventures in Ukraine, is this long period of construction, whereas completion is sometimes a question mark whether they ever will be completed. But I picked this out because this was the prompt for this research project. I went to university in Philadelphia. I have lived there for many years. I moved from Philadelphia to Kiev, and this development was 2 blocks away or 3 blocks away from my office in Kiev. So you can imagine my sort of serendipity or surprise of moving to Ukraine for the first time and immediately encountering at least the name of this place from which I came. It's a sense of the world being smaller than you could ever know. Of course, I think it's quite funny because kind of like Philadelphia, Philadelphia is a tricky city that is by no means perfect. It is quite, it has its own challenges like every other city, and so I thought it was kind of beautiful that the letter E, somebody had stolen it or it had broken off. So Philadelphia, you know, it's missing this element. And I think it's a nice metaphor for a lot of these development projects that it reaches a certain degree of commonality or likeness, but it doesn't ever achieve a perfect twinning or simultaneousness. Saga Development, the city series is a series that they have. So they have San Francisco Creative House near Plosha Paramoho. They have the Chicago Central House, which is more near Palazzo Ukraina, near M17 Contemporary Arts Center. Washington Concept House, and then Boston Creative House, which is in the Puchina district of Kiev. I think it's kind of interesting. Saga Development has kind of their own system of ranking the value of these cities, or who these cities, the most appropriate customer for them would be. So Chicago Central House and Washington Concept House, for example, are targeted at a business plus customer, which is implied to be a customer that has more money. They're more expensive apartments to buy. Whereas the San Francisco Creative House and the Boston Creative House are for a comfort customer. I think there's something kind of funny here in that the creative houses are the poorer houses, like the houses for people with less money, which has some sort of maybe small dig or jab at the cultural sector as being of less value than the business sector. And I also think, I wonder what the, and this is something I constantly had to ask myself in preparing this research, was what was the sort of attitude or logic of the developer in conceiving these names? Because, for example, it makes quite a lot of sense that San Francisco is a creative house, because San Francisco is the capital of the startup industry in the world, home to Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, all these creative companies that are changing the way we live. Whereas Boston, on the other hand, does not have a reputation for creativity. I would say Boston's reputation is more about patriotism or about even conservatism to some extent in terms of sort of traditional values, maybe. So this is something the language and the pairing of city to concept or city to central or city to creative is revealing but also a bit puzzling. Then I kind of dug a little bit deeper into this topic because I moved to an apartment near Lvivska Square in Kiev. And when I needed to go anywhere or to really meet anyone or go through errands, I would need to walk by this restaurant, quite posh restaurant called Alaska. Alaska restaurant is one of several very, very, very high-end restaurants in Kiev, and I would say something striking is that it is in the Lvivska Square area rather than the Bessarabska area. So there is already a very harsh conflict between more of a sort of hipster populace and ultra-luxury customers of a restaurant like Alaska. And so I call this section Consuming the Frontier. Because in the sort of American imagination, Alaska is this last frontier. Alaska is this great expanse, this huge state that humans haven't so much taken control of yet. It's still very wild, stereotypically. But for the sake of these very high net worth people that are eating at this Alaska restaurant, Alaska is something they can consume. They can eat it. They can be part of it. And again, sort of thinking about geographies and relationships between different geographies, I really appreciate that the Alaska restaurant is not just like a restaurant serving food native to Alaska. It's actually serving a sophisticated Mediterranean cuisine with Italian motifs, king crabs, and the freshest seafood. So I love this like thing where king crabs would never grow in the Mediterranean. They live like in the north, but you have this thing where king crabs are being cooked in a Mediterranean style somehow. And so you have this mixture of the Alaskan frontier and this very chill by the beach Mediterranean lifestyle. I also wanted to say I have really enjoyed reflecting on and digging deeper into the website for this Alaska restaurant. On their homepage, they have this tagline that said, "Food is a hero," which I think in a country like Ukraine that has been through Artyoms and Gagarins and all these sorts of people, to wind up in 2020 and 2021 with food being the ultimate hero, that's sort of quite an evolution to consider how food has now taken this heroic spotlight, at least in the case of this one restaurant. That said, I think it's really important to problematize or challenge what a restaurant like Alaska represents. Alaska is presenting an immaculate or a pristine image that is so absorbing that it allows Alaska's customers to totally immerse in a storm of their own status and ignore the assault on the less well-heeled pedestrian's psyche when access to Alaska's wide-open expanse is obstructed by an aggressive congestion of luxury vehicles. So as I mentioned before, Alaska is this place that is known for scale. It is known for the immenseness of nature and the minimal presence of man. But at Alaska restaurant in Kiev, the general impression is that this is a place where people park their Mercedes and Rolls Royces and Bentleys on the sidewalk, and you have to walk around them. So machines have won out over this expanse, and machines have made their own expanse to a certain extent. And so as we continue deeper into this presentation, the case or example of Alaska in Kiev obliges the question, when an instance of commonality, and again when I say commonality, I am saying common as in this name is here and this name is here, and it's proclaiming a likeness or a togetherness. When an instance of commonality draws attention to inequality, does the conciliatory, and conciliatory meaning commonality as something that brings together rather than drives apart, does that component or aspect of commonality lose its cause or purpose or potential or possibility? Now we'll go into the next section of this presentation, which is politics as usual or politics as unusual. We are now moving from Kiev to Lviv, and specifically to the development projects of Riel Real Estate Corporation. So in Lviv, one of their flagship projects is Житловий Complex America, or Living Complex America, which has this great tagline of territory of your capabilities, which for me it's a really poignant reflection on the American dream, this idea of America as this place of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, that American dream has been significantly challenged over, especially over the last 5 years. So to see a development corporation in Lviv proclaiming it with such proudness and authority, it warms my heart. And I would also emphasize, you see this top banner at the very top of the image. I really love how it goes from blue to red, and you have all the shades between blue and red. So you have all these purples in the middle of blue and red. And that's something that's really, that spectrum of colors or shades, it's really exciting in that at the present moment in the United States, these spectrum doesn't seem to exist so much. You have a lot of blue, meaning Democrat, and you have a lot of red, meaning Republican, but all the shades between these two poles, they're somewhat invisible or absent often. So I really love this ability to embrace and uplift the purples. I also think it's quite striking the extent to which different stereotypes about different countries or locales are represented or exemplified in the marketing or PR material of these Žitlovy complex. This is another project by Real Estate Corporation in Lviv called Žitlovy Complex Velika Britannia, or Living Complex Great Britain. And whereas Living Complex America was all about this, it being a territory of your capabilities, or a territory in which you can achieve a new self or achieve a new potential. The people who live in Žitlovy Complex Velika Britannia are striving for something different, in that the owner of an apartment in Great Britain will emphasize the aristocracy of his soul and his commitment to respectability. So of course this is this sort of a very the long lineages that exist in Great Britain, the titles that exist there, and this aristocratic sentiment of Great Britain is embodied in the construction of this Žitlovy complex. And I think this is a good moment to also emphasize that something to continuously consider when looking at these new development projects is the extent to which you can see the language or marketing material for these projects, how much they are reflected in the actual construction. When you look at this image of this rendering of this apartment building, does it scream to you Great Britain? Would you see it as a Great British apartment building if you hadn't read the PR materials? So the extent to which words are masquerading or coloring or transforming our vision of the place. I also think it's something that's interesting to talk about with these countries. These country-based Žitlovy complex is questions of double citizenship. This is something that often in the Ukrainian conversation comes up, is about multiplicity of passports, singularity of origin, things of this nature. So my question is, what would happen if you bought an apartment in both the Living Complex America and Living Complex Great Britain? would the territory of your capabilities of Living Complex America plus or add on to the aristocratic values of Living Complex Great Britain, or would they cancel each other out and you would be left where you were at the beginning? And then how would that then change further if, say, for example, you purchased an apartment in Living Complex America as your place of residence, and then you purchased an apartment in Living Complex Great Britain to sublet as an investment piece. So the extent to which one can question one's identity or national allegiance through apartment purchases. Another flagship property in Real Estate Corporation's portfolio is the Żytly Complex Schengen, which has the tagline Moja personalna Europa. So I find this to be very something to meditate on, this Żytly Complex Schengen, because of course Ukraine's journey to joining the Schengen area is ongoing. Ukraine's desire or mission to join the Schengen area has been full of different detours or traffic jams. Sometimes it seems as though the process is getting quite close. Sometimes it seems as though the process is receding into the distance. And so for those that are not willing to wait anymore for Ukraine to join Schengen zone, they can go ahead and purchase an apartment in Lviv. So Real Estate Corporation has fast-tracked the process of Ukrainian ascension into Schengen, allowing buyers to purchase their own personal Europe in the form of a 1, 2, or 3 room flat. So you can have your own little piece of Europe, one little percentage of Europe. Of course, the sort of imperialistic or colonial or anti-colonial overtones of this development is quite profound, because of course it's something that Żytly Complex Schengen is being built in Lviv rather than, say, Mariupol. Lviv is directly on the border to Schengen. You are only not so many kilometers away from the Polish border, and so you are really on the edge of Schengen when you are living in Lviv. I also want to talk about something that's very interesting with how Real Estate Corporation is, what their understanding of Europe is and what their understanding of Schengen is, because Europe is a continent. Europe is not just the European Union. The European Union is not the 100% totality of Europe. Europe is something that extends much farther. And the Schengen area has nothing to do with geography. The Schengen area is a mobility zone. The Schengen area is a place where you can move without passports. The whole idea of Schengen was to facilitate communication across the borders of European Union countries, so as to facilitate trade opportunities, cultural exchange, educational exchange. And so Schengen is a passport-driven way of existing in a part of the European entity. And as I'm trying to articulate here, Schengen is about an extensive degree of transparency or removing barriers for movement, whereas these Żytly complex are privatized. Żytly complex is a place where you need a key card or a key code to enter into those spaces. So in some sense, it's the equal inverse of the promise of what Schengen is. I want to also speak a little bit about the logo for Żytłowy Komplex Schengen. It has the appearance of the Cyrillic alphabet sh sign, which I find is interesting because no country that is a part of the Schengen area uses this Cyrillic alphabet. So in the official understandings of what Schengen is, this character is never present. But Real Estate Corporation is asserting its presence in this conversation, in this entity. You can also understand this logo to be an E that has been turned from vertical to sideways. So it's E for Europe. So Żytłowy Komplex Schengen has changed the orientation of what Europe is. Europe as this sort of authoritative entity has been twisted and turned on its side and made into a more horizontal entity in that sense. If you want to become a bit more abstract or a bit more nationalistic, you can see the logo for Żytłowy Komplex Schengen as suggesting the Ukrainian Trizub, as seen in some Ukrainian political parties, use different animated versions of the Trizub. So if one wants to see this in this logo, I am of the understanding that it is possible to see the Trizub mirrored in this logo. Finally, in commenting on the logo, is that it has this emoji-like castle. It looks like some sort of fortification with a tower in the middle, which for an apartment building, to suggest that it looks like a castle for the people, a castle for the emerging middle class. There's something almost fairy tale-like about that allusion. Now the next segment of this presentation is, I call it elementary appeal, or elementary apparition. So appeal is this appeals to you, or I am appealing to you in the sense that I'm appealing that this looks like this. Versus an apparition, which an apparition is another word for ghost. So an apparition is something that is a shadow or a ghost or a trace or a false promise in that sense. So this represents a shift in this presentation away from place and towards people. So encanted or proclaimed commonality in the Ukrainian-built environment is not restricted to appropriated place or copied place or mirrored place or doubled place. People are called upon as well. So another one of real estate corporations projects is Żytłowy Komplex Sherlock Holmes, which is on Pekarska Street in Lviv. It's on Baker Street, which is the street which Sherlock Holmes lived on in London in the Sherlock Holmes novels. And so, whereas the previous projects that I have emphasized focused on countries or cities or locations being turned into an individual apartment building or restaurant, the Sherlock Holmes and other, in this next segment I will talk about, is suggesting a different thing about what living can be and what living in one's home can be. So the Zhytlovy complex Sherlock Holmes is suggesting that living is a form of authoring. When we are living in a place, we are authoring our story in that place. And so how this is connoted in the press materials for this project is that, quote, hundreds of stories can be written in this house, one of which is yours. So when you buy an apartment in this building, you are writing your story, which is one chapter or one book in a great series of shared humanity in that sense. But it's like so amazing. I'm sorry, it's so freaking amazing with this Zhytlovy complex, because they take this question further, because they are dig into the debate over whether when we are living, are we authoring a story that is a fictional story or a non-fictional story. And they do this by talking about Sherlock Holmes himself. So they have this quote that's on their website that says, 1 in 5 people in the UK believes that Sherlock Holmes was a real person. Lviv residents can confirm that he not only exists, but also looks great. Oh my gosh, amazing, no? It's like so amazing quote. I could like spend the whole presentation talking about it. Because one, I mean, it's like so beautiful how stories written like over 100 years ago in England, they can be confirmed as fact now in 21st century Lviv. There's also this thing about Sherlock Holmes as a person, but now Sherlock Holmes is also a building that looks great. So it's a beautiful proclamation. And of course, you can't have Sherlock Holmes without Dr. Watson.
Okay.
So they go hand in hand in this way. And so this is also kind of furthering this idea of living and placemaking, and that Dr. Watson is quoted as being a real friend who is time-tested, remains faithful over the years, and is ready at any moment to lend a hand. And so this has an interesting suggestion here, because it suggests that like the Dr. Watson is your confidant. When you buy an apartment in this building, Dr. Watson is your friend in this way. So in a sense, you become some sort of Sherlock Holmes. This is I also want to. This is the point in my research for this, that I had this understanding where I was starting to get an understanding of the personalities or attitudes of these developments, but I also became very aware that these properties know who I am, because of course these are businesses that are trying to sell you something, and they track your movements online. So I started getting all these emails in my spam folder being like, do you want to buy an apartment in Zhytlovy complex Sherlock Holmes, or do you want to buy an apartment in Zhytlovy complex Schengen? So there's also this idea around commonality of I am becoming more in common with these buildings the more time I spend looking at them. And these buildings are also getting to understand me at the same time, because they're knowing that I am somebody who is interested in apartments. I'm not interested in buying one, but maybe not. This is also a point where I want to look a little bit at this term Zhytlovy complex. Zhytlovy complex, or living complex. One can break that up as saying life is complex. Life is not simple or straightforward. Life has complexity to it. Life has different aspects that challenge us or thrill us And so what were to happen if you change the words židlivé complex from living complex to complex living? So we are living in complex times, we have complex living. It reminds me of, I did another research project a few years ago where I was specifically focusing on an artist named Corey Archangel, who had a fashion line that was dealing with athleisure and garments that you wore when you were relaxing or chilled, garments that were stereotypically understood to be business casual outfits or clothes or wardrobe. And I was asking him if there was ever going to be an exhibition of your fashion garments, what you would call it, and he said it would be casual business. So this idea of business casual becoming casual business. And wouldn't that be nice if all business was casual business? Does all business need to be business? Moving on. So we just spent a little bit of time thinking about authors in authorship, and about how the characters from a book come off the page into 3D space, how the characters in a book become your confidant or peer or the walls in which you live. It's also important to consider what happens when a canvas becomes a complex. And you can do that. And you can do that in židlivé complex Renoir. So you are living in Renoir at living complex Renoir. You can read this translation at the bottom. Maintained in the classical spirit and impressionistic landscapes open from its windows. So there is this impression that when you are buying or renting or subletting or staying overnight in an Airbnb at židlivé complex Renoir, you are in the middle of a canvas of Renoir. You are somehow living within some of his brushstrokes. And furthermore, this židlivé complex Renoir has this ability to transcend its built infrastructure and expand onto the landscape around. So when you are in your apartment in židlivé complex Renoir, you are just in one part of a canvas that you are a part of. So you see the built infrastructure around here, that is just one piece of the scenery within one contained canvas. And this is definitely a challenging idea to try to wrap your head around. The fact that when I am falling asleep at night, I am just one small detail in a great painting by a great master of art history. This is this idea that is then furthered in židlivé complex Monet. This idea of the background of the painting or the subject of a painting, how it feeds into the foreground, how it merges into another character. So I like this idea of Riel created the house as an organic continuation of the landscape. That's I think something that we are talking about landscape here in this residency. One, of course, organic forms. What is an organic form? Is this an organic form? Is that an organic continuation of the landscape? Is it just a continuation of the landscape? Is it how is it crushing the landscape? Is it making the landscape better? That's something that I think the morals and motives of that relationship or of that sense of purpose in the building is something that needs to be critically reflected upon. Those two apartments, Židliový complex that I just mentioned, there's an idea that the meaning of this apartment building goes beneath the surface or the walls of the building. The meaning or substance of this development is more than just what happens on the skin. It's something that happens inside the building, in the organs of the building, in the brushstrokes of the building. Something very, very different is happening with Židliový complex Andy Warhol. Židliový complex Andy Warhol is also in Lviv. And in this apartment building, the significance or meaning of the building is concentrated more on the surface of the building, on the outer edge. And so as you can see in this image, all along this end wall, you have these stencils of butterflies, which are done in a manner which suggests how Andy Warhol did his screen prints. Andy Warhol was quite famous for being a pioneer of screen printing as a way for quickly multiplying an artwork or removing the obsessive individuality of an artwork, opening up opportunities for replication. But I find it to be quite troubling that they chose the butterfly as the emblem of Andy Warhol's artistic practice, because while Andy Warhol did make butterflies, they figure in a very, very minor position in his portfolio. Butterflies is not one of the defining characteristics of Warhol's oeuvre. If I were Riel, if I had the power to choose what emblem they would stencil onto the building, I would have chosen perhaps Marilyn Monroe. I think Andy Warhol's gold Monroes are just a fantastic sort of time capsule or embodiment of the excess of Hollywood glamour, which Warhol himself helped bring to the world and amplify. I also think one could make a case for, instead of doing the butterfly, doing a Campbell's soup can. There's this phrase in English, I don't know if it translates into Ukrainian or Russian, that you are what you eat. So I think this idea that you would live inside of a Campbell's soup can when you live in Židliový complex Andy Warhol, you would be are what you eat at that sense in that moment. You could also put Elvis Presley on there, another one of Andy Warhol's signature subjects. And Elvis Presley is like the hunka hunka burning love. He's the king of love in that sense. He's a crooner, and so if you lived inside of a building with that sex symbol, it would be such a sexy place in which to live. Why not? Or if you wanted to get perhaps a bit more morbid or dark, you could choose the electric chair, which is from one of my favorite Andy Warhol series, which is his Death and Disaster series, where Andy Warhol looked at different instruments of pain and instruments of capital punishment. And then I think it's this is when my sort of tension between the PR industry and the PR obsession with spectacle begins to really distort the honesty or veracity of what the artists themselves pictured themselves. Because in the press release for Židliový complex Andy Warhol, Real Estate Corporation say he is our famous eccentric countrymen. So this is a property development firm that is trying to suggest that Andy Warhol is Ukrainian, which is, I think, a debate or discussion that is a very worthy or valid debate to have. I mean, Andy Warhol was Lemko. His parents came from a very small village that was right on the Slovak border with Ukraine. They lived on the Slovakian side of this border. And then they emigrated to the United States. But the Lemko, of course, is a group of people that lived across Slovak and Ukrainian territory, as well as, I believe, some Polish territory too. And so, in a sense, by saying that Andy Warhol is Ukrainian, this is also this property development firm saying Lemko is Ukrainian and nothing else. So there's a possessiveness to this argument or suggestion. And this proclamation competes directly with the words of Andy Warhol himself, who had this famous quote that said, "I prefer to remain a mystery. I never like to give my background, and anyway, I make it all up different every time I'm asked." So Andy Warhol is someone that not only is vague about his origins, he is purposely trying to lead people in different directions to try, those who want to understand his origins. And by that he's saying that his origins remain a mystery in that way. And so perhaps my sort of troubled understanding of the attitude of Żytliwy complex Andy Warhol is saved by the fact that Żytliwy complex Andy Warhol is, in a sense, a corporation, which Andy Warhol, as an artist, wanted to be the first business artist. He wanted to be an artist that was so totally merged with the art market and with business practices that Andy Warhol, the person, and Andy Warhol, the business entity, became totally intertwined with one another, where you couldn't separate them anymore. And so, in a sense, ЖК, Andy Warhol, is Andy Warhol Incorporated. Then we pivot from Lviv to Odessa, where you have Kandinsky Odessa residence, which has over 900 apartment buildings, which has 900 apartment in series of apartment buildings. So there's also this funny thing where the number of Kandinsky apartments vastly outnumbers the number of Kandinsky artworks. So there are greater additions for apartments than artworks. But from my impression, and of course I'm open to debate or critique or conflicting perspectives, is that the slickness, and by slickness I mean the sort of the shininess or metalness of the Kandinsky Odessa residence consumes the soul of a Kandinsky composition, which a Kandinsky composition is so much about playing with forms, playing with gestures, reaching out in some sort of new direction, trying to achieve some new transcendent emotion with color in a way that a luxury apartment building made of glass and metal struggles to achieve that transcendent character. You can see in the rendering, this is another property that's not finished yet, that there are some aspects of a Kandinsky artwork that are reflected in the details of the building. So you have arcs and fissures and jagged lines that are projected and etched into the lobbies. But my then game that I want to play is that if this design of a building is crushing the soul of a Kandinsky composition, what if Kandinsky's response was to have his soul be present within the building? So what if Kandinsky soul was living in Kandinsky Odessa residence today as some sort of immense mausoleum to Kandinsky? Would Kandinsky's soul suggest that the life lived within this building would be full of abstract feelings or abstract events, moments of uncertainty or radical expression? Would there be synesthetic sensations, which synesthesia is like a visual experience where colors are closely connected with emotions, and colors are closely connected with feelings. This then, I saw a Facebook post by Alina Yakovenko, who said that she got a pop-up advertisement for Kandinsky Odessa residence, and she was thinking that it was an open call for an artist in residency program at Kandinsky, which I think is, of course it could be. Of course it could be. Now we're getting towards the end of this presentation, although there really is no end to this potential topic. And I'll call this small segment Enlightenment in Control. So we will go from Odessa back to Kiev. But first I will say this is another phrase in English that you are only as good as the company you keep, and by that it means you are only as good as the people you surround yourselves with. So you are understandings of you are dependent upon understandings of the people you associate with. So you are defined in relation to the people you surround yourself with. And so, as this presentation has hoped to suggest, is that the company or people in contemporary Ukrainian construction is prestigious. I mean, it's full of masters of literature and of art, not only of Eastern Europe, but of Europe at large and even the world. So the company kept is quite prestigious, but there is no single procedure or method or ability to privatize people and places occupying prominent positions in the global public consciousness. There is no single way of privatizing X person into Y building. It's not a formulaic experience or formulaic construction process. It is a formula that is uniquely tied to each person in each place. In Kiev you have Einstein Concept House, which has done a slight changing the words of a very famous quote that Albert Einstein did, that said, concern for the man himself and his fate must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors. It's a very Einstein-like quote that is a bit inscrutable at the surface, but as the developer, which is Saga Development, interprets or embodies this quote, is that they make Einstein Concept House a very high-tech building. It's a building that is defined by different facial recognition softwares, different fingerprint access. It's billed as or branded as a very tech-savvy and tech-driven living experience. And okay, that then forces a question of Einstein lived in a moment that was really at the very beginning of this tech boom. In many ways, Einstein's philosophy, Einstein's ideas predicted or provided a huge push to the boom of tech. But in a way, Einstein Concept House has transferred or has shared a lot of the Einstein genius with remote control machines. And so, as I see it, he who wrote enlightened formulas, formulas that helped the world understand itself in a new way, has been turned or remembered or memorialized or monumentalized in a home that offers a very formulaic style of living. Formulaic meaning, driven by these routines that are meant to protect you, but also shield you away from the world to a certain extent. Then the kind of throw in another sort of wrench into the system. There's another development group which often partners with Saga called Perfect Group, which of course any construction company that labels itself as perfect is setting a very high bar for itself. What happens if it doesn't live up to this promise of perfection? And we will be able to see as they continue with building the complex Stanford, which is also in the Palazzo Ukraina district of Kiev. I think one thing that's already worth noting is that, of course, Stanford comes from Stanford University, which Stanford University is one of the premier institutes of higher education, not only in the United States, but in the world. Stanford University is very closely associated with planning for the future. It's right next to Silicon Valley, so right next to San Francisco, right next to this world of new futures. And so Stanford in this Zhitli complex is being labeled as a business classica, which to already label something as being classic seems to sort of blunt or remove some of the potential for the building to achieve its full form. And then also, it's interesting in that Stanford's colors are red and white, and Stanford Business Classica is orange and black. I'm now very close to the end of my presentation. I hope I have not bored you. I will say that thinkers like Einstein, geniuses like Einstein, people like Einstein who for a living created ideas or realized new ways of understanding, their primary responsibility was to produce knowledge or to make knowledge, and to make knowledge that could make the world better. And that knowledge that they create is known as their intellectual property, which of course then creates a nice conduit or a bridge between intellectual property or property of the mind and property that exists in physical space. And so often when you are trying to create the incentive to produce knowledge, you protect one's intellectual property. This can be through patents, trademarks, copyrights, etc. It's like how, for example, there's a big debate today about whether the Pfizers and Modernas of the world should be given patent access or patent protection for the vaccines they created, because if they are not, the investment that Pfizer, Moderna, etc. made to create the vaccine, they won't be able to profit off of. And then in the future, when there is another pandemic, there won't be the incentive to create a vaccine, because the companies will know they won't be able to make back the money they invested in creating the vaccine. So anyways, this brings us back to this topic of intellectual property, or the knowledge we create, how that is privatized, and how strict that privatization exists. This then leads to a very important concept for society, often used in economic theory, but also in sociological theory, anthropological theory, things of this nature. And this is a social understanding called the tragedy of the commons, or maybe not social understanding, but social polemic or problem, which perhaps some of you may be familiar with. And so the idea of the tragedy of the commons is that you have a shared resource. You have, for example, a field that anybody can come and use. And so say this field that has this great soil, if you have a certain number of cows that come and graze on that field, or maybe the farmers who live nearby, they can come and bring their cows there to eat the grass and take advantage of this great field. That can be a great resource, a shared resource to make things healthier and to make things grow. But if then the next year the friends of the farmers hear about this great field that's open for anybody to use, they will also bring their cows there. And then if you have all the farmers bringing all the cows to this field, that field will no longer provide nutrition, that field will become overused, and it will die. And so there's this idea with the tragedy of the commons of trying to create a resource that society can share or use and benefit from together. But there's always a tipping point where that public resource gets overused, and something that could have been a public good becomes depleted. So one can understand, for example, some of the things with Einstein. One can interpret this as a case of the tragedy of the commons, which in this case could be understood as greed meaning thirstiness or a desire to use, as exhausting or depleting or killing a resource or entity which could have endured, which could have persisted, and effloresced meaning blossomed, in a setting or context defined more by precaution and solidarity. Okay, finally, to wrap this presentation up, I will say that there is no title authority, that the titles that I've talked about over the course of this presentation, some of the titles tell the truth, some of the titles lie. Titles can be a signature, it can be a way of signing a name onto something or labeling it. Titles can be a pseudonym, or titles can be a fake name in that sense. And titles can also change. So for example, like in the process of doing this research, Jutlevi Complex Andy Warhol was transferred from management of Real Estate Corporation to a different development agency, and so the old website for Żytłowy Complex Andy Warhol can now only be accessed via the Internet Wayback Machine. There's now a new website that has a new description of this project. I will say it's also really, really important to emphasize is that the titles or projects that are included in this presentation are for entities or things or buildings or restaurants which have been heavily promoted and can be possessed or privatized or owned or made exclusive, like apartments. These titles or entities are primarily targeting the upwardly mobile, meaning people that are building economic capital, whether that be through legal means or illegal means, it doesn't matter. But these projects are billing themselves as an investment in a brighter future. They are also being sold to the established elite. So this then is quite a counterpoint or a stab in the back to this idea of commonness, because the people who are perhaps buying an apartment in Żytłowy Complex Sherlock Holmes may not be reminiscent of your image of a commoner or a member of the mass public. I would say that there is also so many other ways in which one can approach or engage with Żytłowy Complex and contemporary Ukrainian development. One can, for example, look at trying to find poetry and poetic justice in the built environment. For example, there's at the metro stop Lukyanivska in Kiev, you have Żytłowy Complex Lukyansky. I will let that take a moment to sink in. It's like Lukyansky at Lukyanivska. So there's this wonderful, real Shakespearean attitude to Żytłowy Complex Lukyansky. That's quite profound. And then also one can think about some of the cheekiness or the humor that exists with Żytłowy Complex, because I find it very powerful that in the site where this nightclub Plivka used to exist in Kiev, they are now building a Żytłowy Complex called White Lines, which of course one can read cocaine into this, which is a notorious party drug. And so this idea that the memory of so many great parties or raves that happened at Plivka is now being embodied in this massive White Lines building. So when you see this Żytłowy Complex, you just see lines of cocaine, don't you? It's quite obvious. Just kidding. But yeah, so to kind of really finalize this, I would say that commonality is not something that is in name only. What I hope this presentation has suggested is that none of the projects I have mentioned are Potemkin villages. They are not an empty facade. There is a real opportunity to rethink or recalibrate our sense of being in the world when we are surrounded by all these new buildings and the morals they represent or potentials they speak to. That said, a common name, Philadelphia, Renoir, can conjure an uncommon existence. A name like that can let you live inside of a painting. A name like that can let you live inside of your own personal Europe, whatever that means. So one can conceive a standalone construction of steel, glass, and concrete as you can see in those simple materials, you can see a whole city, you can see a whole canvas, you can see a whole confidant or friend. And finally, constructed in Ukraine, this uncommon existence is ultimately a form of coexistence. A coexistence with neighbors of all shapes, sizes, statures, and spirits. Thank you very much.
Thank you.